But I hope to, I've really enjoyed over the past 2 or 3 weeks reading up as much as I possibly can. I do have some distant family ties to Scotland, and part of my family is from that, they're part of the McGregor clan. Apparently, though I've never been over there. So hopefully y'all will enjoy what I have to talk about. I want to talk a little bit about some of the different ecosystems that we see over there, some of the different animals we see over there, and things along that nature. First off, I'm assuming everybody knows where Scotland is. It's just north of England. It's part of the British Isles. But one of the things that's interesting when we start looking about where Scotland is relative to where we are now, it is a good bit north. And if you look at where it is as far as where it is on latitude, which we think the further latitude, the further north you go, the colder it's going to be. It's in line with places like Moscow and St. Petersburg and Alaska. Okay. Which is really kind of interesting.
But we're going in June.
It's really kind of interesting because of the fact that when you get there, it's got so much more of a moderate climate than you would expect for being at such a great latitude. When we start comparing it to temperatures like in Moscow or Alaska, we see that yes, it is cooler than here, but it doesn't quite get nearly as cold as you would expect, given what latitude it's at. The other nice thing is, in the summer, it doesn't get nearly as hot as it does down here. So y'all are hitting it at a perfect time when you're going in late May, early June. I would definitely say bring a jacket, bring lots of layers, because depending on where you are, it could get pretty chilly there during this time of year. Well, one of the reasons for this is partially because it's an island. Islands that are surrounded by large bodies of water have what we refer to as a maritime climate. And what that means is that the water, the ocean that's surrounding it, acts as kind of like a heat sink or a buffer in drastic changes. So in the summertime, any heat, the solar radiation gets absorbed by the ocean. And so it doesn't quite get as hot. And in the winter, that heat that's stored up in that water gets released, and it warms the temperature up. So you don't see really high temperatures or really low temperatures in these maritime climates. The other thing particular to the British Isles is that the ocean currents, the way the ocean currents work is, there's a huge Atlantic current that comes along the equator, okay, heading west, and then once it hits the Gulf of Mexico and the eastern United States, suddenly it shifts and heads back east. That warm tropical water from the equator gets pushed right into England, right into the British Isles. So now not only are you surrounded by water that acts as a moderating force for that, we also have this really warm water current that comes up there and warms that area. Okay? Which means you typically have much warmer climates there in Scotland than you would expect given the latitude. Another thing that ends up happening because of this is that you've got that warm water coming up, warming that air, and the wind currents tend to go from west to east. So you have a lot of really wet air that's coming from the ocean that's warm. When it hits Scotland, particularly when it hits the Highlands, that air rises, and suddenly that causes the air to drop all the water. And this is one reason why when we think of Scotland, we think of really rainy weather. Because you've got those mountains in the uplands and the highlands, really warm, moist air that hits that island and causes it to rain. These two things, the mild temperatures or that moderate change in temperatures and the amount of rainfall, really have a huge driving force in what types of animals and plants that we see in this area. So when we think about this as Scotland, we're going to talk about 3 main geographical regions. The lowlands, which are in the southern part of Scotland. The islands, which includes a set of islands including Shetland Island, Orkney Island, and the Hebrides, and highlands. Okay? The highlands represent that, what we think of as the more northern area of Scotland. Okay? So we'll start off with the Scottish lowlands. The Scottish lowlands are that southernmost part of Scotland that borders with England. Okay? This is the most populated region. This is where most all the big cities are, Edinburgh, Glasgow. Those areas, it's also the most productive as far as agriculture goes. This is typically where you see majority of the agriculture going on. Very fertile soil, still plenty of rainfall. This is where they do a lot of livestock herding, so this is where you typically see a lot of the sheep, a lot of the cows and things like that. One of the other things, I don't know how many of y'all are into fishing, but Scotland is a wonderful destination place for fishing. Some of the best fishing as far as for salmon is in Scotland. The area, River Tweed, this lowland area, is one of the top places for fishing for salmon. The River Tweed is one of the best places. There's a couple other ones. The River Tay and the River Annan. But the other thing is, it doesn't require a license. So if you're going on the trip, you might want to check out a fishing rod. Rent a fishing rod, go out there and fish, because it doesn't cost anything extra. You just have to have permission from the landowner. And you can kind of see by the fish these gentlemen are holding here, that would be pretty nice. Those are some decent sized fish. So I would love to go out there now. After reading about this, I'm like, okay, this is going to be one of my destinations now, to go over there and try to fly fishing over there. The next area we'll talk about real briefly is the island regions. There are several different groups of islands. There's the Hebrides, which are off there to the western portion of Scotland. So you can kind of see that group of islands that's off there to the west, and then a little bit closer are the inner and outer Hebrides. And then north of Scotland, we have the Orkney Islands and the Shetland Islands. Talk a little bit about the Hebrides first. These are on that western shore. So remember, we have lots of rain that's coming from east to west and hitting that western coastline. So this tends to be an area where you have lots and lots and lots of rain. We also see that this is an area where we have really distinctive ecosystems, one of the rarest ecosystems in Europe. An ecosystem called the Moor. And this is a coastal system that is driven by all that rain and the fact that you're right there on the coast. It's a very sandy ecosystem, so there's really well-drained soils. It's very rich in calcium from all the seashells that get washed up there on the shore. And it's located between the dunes, right there on the beach, and where you begin to get up into the more upland areas. This place is well known for its beauty as far as flowering. Beautiful groups of flowers. It's extremely rich with regards to the flora that's there. Lots of native orchids, irises, poppies, all these types of things. And summertime is usually when it peaks, so if you're traveling over there with the group, it might be a little early to catch the peak of the flowering. But what you will catch is the peak of the breeding season for a lot of the shorebirds, particularly ladybirds. This is a beautiful area to go over there. This is where a lot of the birds, the aquatic birds, come up there and kind of rest to feed before they travel further north during the summer. So between May and June is the peak time to go there watching for bird watching. If you get a chance to go off coast a little bit, there's other things. This is one of the best places to go see basking sharks off the coast of Scotland, where the Atlantic waters start running into the North Sea. That mix of warm and cold water makes it perfect for these really, really large animals. This is the second largest shark, second only to the whale shark. And it's only short by a few feet as far as size goes. That's a really big mouth. They do have the largest mouth of any of the sharks. But you will notice that with that big, huge, gaping maw, you don't see any teeth. They have really, really tiny teeth because all they eat are little tiny shrimp, krill, and zooplankton. They're filter feeders, just like whale sharks. They don't eat like what we normally think of with as far as sharks eat. Though I'm still a little hesitant to get near one because, I mean, it looks like you can swallow you whole, which would be kind of disturbing. But they love that mix between the Atlantic and North Sea waters. So they typically swim in large groups up and down that area, and frequently will jump out, breach the water, and slam down. So that is a popular pastime for people to go watching for those. And another species of filter feeder, minke whales, are really common in this area, particularly in late spring, early summer, where they come up there to mate. These are another type of filter feeder. They're relatively small when you think of whales. So they're one of the smaller whales, or particularly baleen whales, filter feeding whales, that are in that area. But again, this is a popular thing that people will go out in boats and look for both asking sharks, minke whales, seals, things like that are off the coast there. The Orkney and Shetland Islands are north of Scotland. They were added to Scotland in the 1470s as part of a dowry from the King of Denmark to James III, the King of Scotland, who was marrying his daughter, Margaret, to the King of Scotland. And as part of the dowry, he said, I'm going to include these two islands. And so since then, they've been part of Scotland. They went from being a protectorate of Denmark to now part of Scotland. They are a little further north, so they're a little bit cooler than a lot of the other places that we see. They are not quite as rich as far as soil goes as the Hebrides. So they're a little bit more rugged, a little bit more rocky. So we don't see as much crop growth there, but we do see that they have some agriculture in the form of livestock. Shetland is famous for some of the sheep that it has. The wool from Shetland sheep is considered to be some of the most prized wool. So if you enjoy knitting while you're up there, you may want to get some Shetland wool. It's apparently exquisitely soft and it's not itchy, but it's also very durable. That's the word I'm looking for, excuse me. The other animal that you probably associate with this, and everybody probably has heard this, would be the ponies of Shetland. So Shetland ponies were bred specifically for this area, predominantly as plow animals or for pulling carts, though they were carried down to England and used in the coal mines in England as cart horses to cart the coal out of the coal mines down in England, just because of the fact that they could fit in the coal mines in small size. They are very rugged little horses, though they are kind of small and short in stature. You can apparently ride them, but I guess that would be, we think of them as for children, but they weren't really designed as children's pets. They were designed as work animals. So they are rather strong and sturdy animals. As far as the Orkney Islands, they have their own variety of livestock. And one of the big famous ones there is the Ronaldsay sheep. This is a very unique and interesting type of sheep that's considered to be threatened as far as a domesticated animal goes, because there's very few of them left. They are really interesting in the sense that they were developed on some of the islands where there wasn't much grass. And what ended up happening is they started to feed on the seaweed that would wash up on the shore. And they're slowly but surely they became adapted, and they're one of the few mammals that almost entirely relies on eating seaweed as its food source. They actually can't eat grass as much because of the fact that their digestive tract has adapted to the nutrients in seaweed. And the grass has too much copper in it for them to be able to eat. If they eat it, they actually become toxic levels of copper, and it harms the sheep. So they typically just feed them seaweed, which is kind of interesting. Something else that we see a lot on these islands are Atlantic puffins, which are super cute and really interesting animals. They are able to fly, but when they're out feeding, they're flying to a location where they want to feed. The way they feed is they dive into the water and they fly into the water. So they use their wings and flippers to move around and catch fish while they're underwater, and bring them back to their nest to feed their chicks. They typically nest on cliff faces and small little cracks and crevices there on the cliff, partially because of the fact that they are not really good at taking off from a flat surface. They can take off in the water as they start to flap. They can run like you see geese do sometimes until they get enough speed to take off. But if they're on the ground, they can't quite get the speed to lift off. So they use those cliffs as jumping off points, where they jump off and they get a little bit of a drop and they can pick up and start flying off. Now, there are populations of these guys that are not doing so well for several different reasons. One is predators. So these guys are adapted to living on islands where there weren't things like rats or cats or foxes. And as those were brought onto some of these islands, the rats in particular are really voracious about eating the eggs. So there's some concern about it. One of the other concerns is that when the chicks get ready to fledge and they get ready to jump off the cliff, they use their the moon as a navigation point for them to be able to figure out which direction do they want to fly. Unfortunately, the city lights get confusing for them, and they think that the city lights are the moon. And so oftentimes they'll fly towards the city. And so people will find baby puffins, or pufflings as they call them, wandering around the street and the sidewalk, and they're not able to take off. So there is a practice to help this out called puffin tossing, where people will gather the puffins and then go out to a cliff and throw them off the cliff. I'm assuming, apparently this happens at night. So I'm assuming the people that are walking around, I'm not sure if conservation is really in their mind when they're saying, hey, let's wander around downtown and pick up some puffins. But it apparently is something that people sit there and say, hey, this does not hurt the puffins because they're able to fly there. And they actually do need that extra elevation to actually start flying. So if you see people gathering puffins while you're there and running off to a cliff, don't think ill of them. They actually are trying to help a little bit. Our next area we'll talk a little bit about are the Highlands. This is one of the areas that most people think of when they think of Scotland. It's the area that I was most drawn to, mainly because, as Dr. Baxter mentioned, I got 2 degrees on Moor Street. This is where a lot of the forests are. So that's why I was kind of naturally drawn to that. It's also less populated, so we do see a lot more different wildlife species that are up here as well. There are 2 main portions to the Highlands. There are the Grampian Mountains, and then what we think of as the Northern Highlands. And typically when we think of the Highlands, we think of the Northern Highlands. But the Grampian Mountains are part of this as well. The 2 areas are divided by an area, a valley area, or a rift between the 2 areas that's referred to as the Great Glen, or Glen Moor. That is a fault line between those areas. This is where you see a vast majority of the freshwater lochs. Lots of rivers, lots of lochs. So on either side of this valley, you have lots and lots of highland areas where the water gathers. All the water runs down into this valley and creates a series of lochs that stretch all the way from Inverness all the way down to the other side of Scotland. Okay, beautiful area. And of course, Loch Ness is part of this. There's the famous picture for the mythical creature that lived in Loch Ness. Please take lots of pictures if you get a shot of that. I would love to see it with regards to that. But this little line here, again, represents a fault line. It is part of a series of fault lines that stretch originally, or I shouldn't say originally, long time ago, between the tectonic plates between North America, Europe, Africa, and South America. So the mountains that we see in the Grampian Mountains and the Highlands were caused when those two continents, the tectonic plates, crashed into each other and caused uplifts on both sides, including the Appalachians. So the Appalachian Mountains and the Grampian Mountains and the Highlands are all part of that same fault line, or that same rift between those two continents. So when they crashed into each other, you had this huge uplift. Those mountains were about the size of the Alps, really, really tall. Then as the continents started to spread apart, separate themselves, it's been a long, long time. It's been 340 million years. They've kind of eroded a little bit, which is one reason why, if you look at the Grampian Mountains and you look at the Appalachians, you may recognize kind of the form. This nice rolling, not necessarily low elevation, but still these nice kind of rolling mountains rather than the jagged peaks that we see when we think of the Rockies or the Alps or the Andes that are much younger mountain ranges. One of the big, special ecosystems that's found in the Grampian Mountains is what's referred to as the Caledonian forests. These are remnant coniferous forests, predominantly covered with Scots pine, which is a special species of pine that's adapted for these really, really rugged, poor soils type of area. High acidity soils, not much else can grow in these areas, but these are the dominant cover for this area. There's several large stretches of this. This is now considered to be a relatively rare ecosystem in Scotland. It used to be much more prolific, spread all throughout the Highland or the Grampian Mountains down into even the lowland region. But now it's just kind of relegated to that Grampian Mountain region. There's lots of different species that are that are specialized and just found in these areas. One of these is referred to as the Scottish wildcat. It is a little bit bigger than a house cat, depending on how big your cat is. But it is distinctively different coloration. It has a very tabby look to it. But these guys generally live on the edge of these forests, hunting small mammals, voles, rats, rabbits, things like that. If you do see one, they do have a very cute, cuddly look. I would not suggest trying to grab one and snuggle it, mainly because of the fact that these are wild animals, obviously, and they are also critically endangered. There's a lot of loss of these, predominantly from habitat loss, but also because of the fact that they're hybridizing with domesticated cats. So they are very closely related to those. There's a really nice documentary on this population called The Tigers of Scotland. I'm not sure if it's still on Amazon Prime, but it was for a while. It's really fascinating to watch the work they've done with them, some of the characteristics of these guys. Some other types of animals that we see there are some of the largest type of grouse that there are in Europe. This one's called the capercaillie. It is only found in these pine forests specifically. It is the largest of the grouses that are in Europe. It is also very sought after as far as, or was very sought after as far as hunting goes. So much so that it was hunted to extinction back in the 18th century. And then they repopulated Scotland with them from individuals that were brought over from Sweden. And for a while they were doing great. And then in recent years the population started to decline again. Partially just because of the fact that these guys lay their eggs on the ground. And we've got lots of new predators that are coming in that are killing out, eating the eggs, and things like that. So again, these are ones that may not be as common as they used to be, but hopefully if you're traveling in this area, you'll get to see them or hear them. One of my favorites that's specialized in this area is this individual, the Scottish crossbill. That is not bad orthodonture. That is actually an adaptation for living in these forests. So their bill is crooked. They don't match up. You see this really extended or long, look like, almost like parrot beaks that come across there. And what they do with that is they use it to pry open the cones, to pry apart the different little scales on each one of those pine cones, and then they stick their tongue down in between there, pull the seed out, and eat those. But they're highly specialized to just eat pine seeds. Now we do have species of crossbills in western North America as well, but this one's just specific to this particular area in Scotland. One of the big things that we think of when we think of the Highlands are the moors. So once we get to the Scottish Highlands or the Northern Highlands, we start seeing that the habitat or the ecosystem changes a little bit. So we've crossed over that Glen Moor, the Great Glen, that fault line, up into the northern portion of Scotland, where we see a lot of rainfall. We don't see much soil. The soil is very acidic. But predominantly it's the rainfall, the amount of rainfall that's there, that makes it really difficult for trees to be able to grow in this area. So you don't see as much forests. You tend to see these highland regions that are just really heaths, meadows, covered with heather, other things like this that fill that area. The other thing is there's so much rainfall that a lot of the plants as they die, they're so soaked with water that they don't decompose. And you get the formation of what are called peat bogs. So peat is just non-decomposed plant material that's been sitting in those really, really moist areas that don't have enough oxygen for them to break down. And they just sit there and sit there and sit there. One of the big things that people would do is they would go in there and dig up the peat, dry it out, and use it as a fuel source to burn. Now, again, this is not the best soil in the world, but we do see limited amount of agricultural here, predominantly with regards to livestock. And one of the famous livestock creatures from this are the Highland cows. These guys are just amazing looking. My big wish was that I could come riding in on a Highland cow. Couldn't find one. As far as, but this was a breed that was domestic or developed in Scotland, particularly in the Highlands, because of the character for the habitat, because of the fact that it is typically relatively cold, very, very wet. They tend to be a little bit smaller than most of what we think as beef cattle, but they are very well adapted for this. They have extremely thick fur. So they have 2 layers of fur. They've got kind of a woolly undercoat, and then a longer outer coat that protects the undercoat from getting too terribly wet. The kind of one coat acts as the insulator, and the outer coat acts as the raincoat to help to shed the water off of them. Okay? They're very cold tolerant. One of the interesting things is the beef they produce, since they've got so much fur, they don't have as much fat on them, so it's a very lean cut of meat. They grow relatively slower because of the fact that it's not the best habitat, which means that apparently the meat is extremely well marbled with small pieces of fat. So if you like steak, apparently this is really, really prime cut of meat. While y'all be touring Scotland, for those of y'all that are going, one of the other things that's really interesting or fun to watch is some of the mating rituals of some of the other grouses that are there. So the black grouse is one of the grouse species that's commonly found up in the Highlands. It's commonly hunted. It's a common game species. But during May and June, they gather together for mating season, which involves the males, which is the image on the left, to try to impress the females. So what they do is the males all gather together at a place called a lecking ground. And they have dance-offs. So the males will get there, and they will all get in a big circle, and then they'll all puff themselves up, raise their tail up, shake their tail feathers, and dance around each other. And the women, the ladybirds, just sit around on the outside and watch and say, okay, I'm picking my partner based on who dances the best. Okay. I'm not going to demonstrate. Don't worry. Some of these can break into fights. But it is something that's really, really interesting to watch. It's real similar to the mating rituals that prairie chickens do in North America out west. I have gotten to watch that. That's really, really just fascinating to watch. They're not quite as colorful as these guys, so I can only imagine this would be a wonderful thing to be able to see. One of the other species that populates this area is the red deer. They have red deer in Scotland and roe deer that are native to those areas. The red deer is the larger species of that. They get quite a good bit bigger than the white-tailed deer that we have around here. So the average white-tailed deer size here in Georgia is somewhere maybe 150 pounds. Is considered a pretty decent sized white-tailed deer. The red deer over there get over 400 pounds. So that's a good bit bigger than what we would see. These are one of the dominant ungulate species or hoofed species, aside from the cattle, that live up in this area and able to feed off that heather. Along with that, while they all are going to be visiting in May, it is going to be close to the calving season where the fawns are born, as well as the time when the males are going to start regrowing their antlers. So they shed their antlers in the winter, they regrow them in the spring so that they can begin to males fight each other for dominance in this late spring, early summer, and then part of that mating ritual. Now, this is a pretty big deer, but it's not the biggest deer that's ever been in Scotland. That goes to the Irish elk, which is a good bit bigger than anything we see. Now, they are extinct. They've been extinct for about 8,000 years, but the last remnant population was in Scotland. These guys are, 400 pounds is big. 1,500 pounds is even bigger. Their antlers were even more impressive. The spread on the antlers was about 14 feet, which is huge. They would use these as means to fight, obviously, for that. There also is a hypothesis that the way the antlers are oriented, that they would use them to kind of signal the females from the long distance, since they were on these large open plains. As the sun reflected off those antlers, it would be kind of like little reflectors so they could attract the females. To give you a little better scale, that's a red deer on the far right. That is a North American moose in the middle, and then there's the Irish elk next to that. So it was a very, very large animal. In a lot of the peat bogs, they have found that's where they find a majority of the skeletons for these. So I know in the museum in Edinburgh, they have a huge collection of the skeletons of these skulls that just look fascinating. Kind of want to finish up. We talked about really large. Then we go to really small. The Scottish midge. I could not warn people about this one. This is something that is probably just as equally well known as being something in the Scottish Highlands as just about anything else. The midge populations, particularly in spring and summer, get to be really, really bad. These are really tiny. So if you've ever been to the coast and you get bitten by what we call no-see-ums, it's more or less what these guys are. Similar sorts of things, but they get in really, really, really dense populations. So that just gets my wife told me not to show that picture. She's like, why would you show that picture? And it's just like,
she was right.
You sorry? But I'll skip through it real quick. Just want to warn you that you should protect yourself. So long sleeve shirts, particularly light colored shirts, they're attracted to darker colors. They are attracted to carbon dioxide that you're emitting, so can't really help that. So. But having long sleeve, light colors will help. Also, around here. I don't know if y'all have ever used Skin So Soft as something to get the no-see-ins or keep the mosquitoes down. Apparently that works just as well for the midges in Scotland as it does for the midges and things that we have here. Though they have a particular brand of insect repellent for midges that they make. It's called Smidge, that you can buy while you're over there. Well, I hate to end on that, but that's where we did end. If you have any questions, I'd love to try to answer some questions. If not, I hope all of you that are traveling over there enjoy. I hope that maybe some of the others that y'all are traveling with the college, maybe you're intrigued enough to travel over there on your own.